After a 27-year career on Wall Street, Stephanie is the founder and CEO of The Way of the Diamond Warrior and author of 2 international best-selling books. As a personal transformation consultant and energy healer, she builds bridges for clients to step more deeply into their own path. Today, she's sharing her personal story about overcoming sexual abuse and multi-generational alcoholism and addiction. She's passionate about how we heal individually and together. Lean in for an exciting, insightful episode. Welcome to the Sober Living Stories podcast. This podcast is dedicated to sharing stories of sobriety. We shine a spotlight on individuals who have faced the challenges of alcoholism and addiction and are today living out their best lives sober. Each guest has experienced incredible transformation and are here to share their story with you. I'm Jessica Stepanovic, your host. Join me each week as guests from all walks of life share their stories to inspire and provide hope to those who need it most. Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Sober Living Stories podcast. Meet Stephanie. She speaks, writes, and teaches on the human condition. She's passionate about helping her clients heal from trauma and live a life free of its constraints. She is one that deeply understands that, as she has found incredible healing in her own story. And today she's going to share that story with us. She healed sexual abuse as well as multi-generational alcoholism and addiction. Welcome, Stephanie. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jessica. It is such an honor to be here.
The disease of alcoholism is often, in many instances, a family disease. And you talk about healing multi-generational alcoholism and addiction. So I'd love to hear your personal story. Go back as far as you want to take us, and let's see what we can learn along the way.
Thank you. As far back as I can remember, there were always cocktails that started in the afternoon, drinks on the weekends, parties, and nothing was out of control, including our emotions. It was just a normal day-to-day thing of cocktails, like I said, mid to late afternoon. And one of the chores that when I was in junior high school that I had to do was to make ice cubes. And it's amazing how something so small can be so impactful to us, because I would hear at that point, my grandmother was living with us. And I was there with my mother, my stepfather, and stepbrother, and younger brothers. And I would hear, Steph, go make the ice cubes. And I would pop out the cubes from the tray from yesterday and refill the trays again for tomorrow. And it meant, and I didn't fully understand this at the time, but that the rest of the afternoon and evening was lost. And what I craved was connection. And what I didn't understand until much later is that the adults were numbing their own pain. We didn't have big conversations about life, about what was happening. And at the time, I was being sexually abused by my stepbrother. It was known, and we didn't talk about it. And that was the age when I first found drugs. I really had no interest at that point in alcohol. Mm-hmm. And yet, when I was high, and it was my neighbor diagonally across the street who introduced me to pot when I was in 8th grade. And I remember sitting out in the woods with my friend Jean. And when I got high, it was like I could feel and I could laugh. And I connected with feelings within me that had been buried because nothing was expressed in my household. And it goes back, my grandfather was an angry drunk and kind of terrorized my mother and my grandmother. And I am at least the 4th generation of women in my family who were sexually abused and not protected by their mother. because women were very powerless. Women didn't have a lot of agency. And when you're tormented within your own family, you're not taught how to speak up for yourself, how to stand up for yourself, how to create any form of healthy boundaries, if they even exist. And so I decided also at that age, about a year after I started smoking pot, and friends started getting into pills, and I found the Percodans that were in the medicine cabinet for the dental work. And it was like, I felt something different when I was high.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I also made the decision at that age of I'm never getting married, I'm never having children, I'm going to college, and I will never be financially dependent on a man because I did not want to be like my mother. So I did go to college and I had the career and I worked on Wall Street for 27 years. I did very, very well in project management and systems. So I supported the trading and the clearing. I wasn't on the front lines. And yet, behind the scenes was just as stressful. And I thrived in chaos. And I thrived in the same chaos that I lived in when I was a child. And yet, and I married two alcoholics. So 10 years twice. And within the course of a year, my second marriage ended, of which we went through rehabs with him, and he's still drinking to this day. I love him dearly, and he is on the other side of the country living his life. And I wish nothing but the best for him. And yet I knew that I couldn't stay. I was doing more for him than he was for himself. I was doing
Right.
more for him than I was for myself. And so I ended the marriage, even though I was still in love with this man. I couldn't, my health was in jeopardy. I had two heart attack scares. I wasn't taking care of myself. I was working 14 hours a day and then coming home and finding anything that I could do to distract myself from what I didn't want to deal with, which
Yeah.
was the exact thing that I grew up with. And then a year after my marriage ended, my 27-year career on Wall Street ended. And all of a sudden, I had this time and was like, what am I going to do with myself?
You know, it's interesting. I heard you made when you were speaking, you made a real decision to become self-sufficient. You said you were not going to be relying on a man for finances. Do you feel like that was a result of not getting the protection that you needed from your family at a time that you needed it most when nobody spoke about the abuse? Like, if they're not going to help, I'm going to do this myself. Where do you think that sprung from?
Absolutely. And that was, if we're into fight, flight, or fear, that was my fight. That was me putting up a hard shell around myself and saying, you know what? I'm going to do what I need to do for me because I am not going to continue to open myself up to the hurt from people who, as children, we have expectations that those who are raising us are going to protect us and care for us and nurture us. And I grew up with the trappings of the white middle class. I had a home, I had food, I had clothes, and everything from the outside looked perfect. And it was a shell.
Yeah.
And it was that same shell that I realized that I was living within, that I created for myself, because I created this hard boundary around me so that no one could get in. And I think this is part of why there's so many people who feel like I have to do this all on my own. There's a lot of lone wolves running
Mm-hmm.
around this world
It's like
because
a
it hasn't
survival
been,
mechanism. Mm-hmm.
it absolutely is survival.
Yeah.
And like I said, it's actually a combination of fight and flight
Mm-hmm.
because I'm fleeing from the rest of the world and creating separation. And I'm going to fight to protect this shell that I've created around myself. And yet, what I found is we still yearn the connection. We still, yearn to be seen. And it's when we start to let down that guard that we've created for ourselves,
Yeah.
as scary as it may be, that's when we really begin to call in what it is that we've wanted all along.
Yeah. And that's the exciting, like, as you were speaking, it hit me in my heart because I can relate to that so much. I too formed a hard exterior for many years throughout my life. And then I could just tell, like, from if it's anything like my journey has been, like, when we get better and we come into our own, the big the most wonderful thing is that you can begin to take that down, right? And then it's life changing. It's absolutely, your edges get softened. You don't have to carry all that because you're not in survival mode anymore. And that's like an exhausting lifestyle. You wouldn't have told me that at the time, but once I came through that, I thought, wow, I'm so glad I don't have to do that anymore.
It is incredibly exhausting, and we don't realize how much so. When you think about how much internal energy, physical, mental, emotional, that it takes to maintain that shell around us,
Mm-hmm.
like it's no wonder why we're always exhausted. And
Right.
yet there's
Yeah.
a beauty in, and it comes in layers. We didn't get here overnight. Unraveling and unwinding these layers that we created for ourselves,
Yes.
this is where we get to give ourselves some grace. So it's not like all of a sudden I'm wide open and I know how to create healthy boundaries, and I know how to stand up for myself, especially with the toxic codependency that comes with a lot of addiction within
Mm-hmm.
families.
Mm-hmm.
It's in stages, and we get to build those muscles. One of the things that we lose is the feeling of internal safety. And so
Sure.
as we unwind some of the old layers, we learn to trust ourselves more. We become more safe in saying, no, I don't want that, or for asking for what it is that we want. And
Mm-hmm.
like I said, we will never be given more than we can handle. And sometimes it is taking one step forward and two back, and we learn a
Mm-hmm.
little bit and we integrate, and then we can take three steps forward.
Yeah. And I think it's a lifelong process. And the trauma for some may be from your family of origin. Would you agree? But like for myself, that wasn't true. It was from an abusive relationship I picked up along the way in my
Mm.
teens. That's when my decision to become self sufficient and put up my wall started. But I didn't realize that. Here I am years, decades later, and not knowing where it started. And I can pinpoint that today, regardless of where that traumatic incident happened. I think that's when we start to add on those unnecessary layer. Well, necessary at the time, but then, shedding them later is the real freedom.
Absolutely. And there is trauma that we also inherit through the DNA. We're in
Mm,
our mother's wombs for 7 to 10 months, depending on when we're pushed out into this world to take our first breath. And there are studies that show that, newborns and infants and young children can smell fear in their mothers. There are studies that are happening looking at war veterans and how anxiety is passed through the sperm. There's a lot more science behind this. And so there are also times where we can feel like, I don't know where this came from.
mhm,
And yet when we look at our family tree, we can see where some of this has been passed down. And that's why I also say healing comes in layers. Like I did therapy. I did 12 step for many years. I was in Al-Anon. It helped give me a voice. It actually helped give me the power and the forthright and the strength to ask my second husband, actually tell him that I wanted a divorce.
mm,
And it was a
mhm,
support group for me. And yet then I saw how stuck a lot of people were in their stories, just as I had been. I played the victim for a long time. I pointed the finger. And I think, as you know, in the rooms, we say, when I point a finger, three are pointing back at me.
Right. Right.
And so when I decided to get out of that mode, and I also saw how stuck a lot of people were in their stories. They wanted to blame their parents. They wanted to blame
Mm-hmm.
the friend. They wanted to blame the coworkers. And yet I am the common denominator.
Right. Right. And I agree with that. 12-step work absolutely saved my life. And then therapy helped me get back into it and understand it. And the greatness about 12-step programs, I believe, is that it is never about anyone else. And because they understand that you're helpless if you're relying on other people to change. The only person that can be changed, that I can change, is myself. So that's very empowering. So the focus is on, what did I do? Where was my responsibility and my part? And then we can move forward.
And there's more that we can do as well. And this is why I focus on the energy work as well, because I think it comes in layers, whether you're doing 12-step before therapy or after it, those are,
Or together. Mm-hmm.
or together, which I
Mm-hmm.
did. And I loved 12-step and the different therapists that I went to that helped me, deal with some of the layers of the abuse. And therapy was good for giving a voice
Sure.
initially to some of the traumas in my story. And yet I found that they weren't, the two of them together weren't enough for me. And
Mm-hmm.
I have a sentence, a phrase that I like to say is, energy work completed the sentence.
Yeah.
Because we have energy that gets stuck in our meridians,
Mm-hmm.
in our chakras. And if you think of it, when you're blowing bubbles outside and you blow air through the little soap thingy and a bubble gets created. When the bubble pops, the energy and the air that created it, as well as the soap, dissipate. When we, at no matter what age, aren't able to express what it is that we're feeling, you can think of it as if we're swallowing that bubble. And when the bubble pops, the energy and the soap stick to our cells.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of our feelings, like fear, is stored in one certain place in a body for the most part, as well as anger in another. So fear a lot of times is stored in the kidney and the bladder, and anger in our gallbladder and our liver. High blood pressure is a lot of times a result of swallowing a lot of those bubbles and internalizing a lot of that anger and anxiety. Over half of the population is walking around with some form of disease that, doctors want to give a pill to. And yet, when we do all of these layers of work, we
Mm-hmm.
actually have the ability to heal ourselves.
So can you speak a little bit to the multi-generational angle of alcoholism and addiction? I know we talk about um, not knowing, well, there's a genetic predisposition to it or not, and people sometimes get hung up on that. So, what did that look like of you not being an alcoholic, but you being part of that whole system?
I numbed my pain just as I saw my parents do and my grandparents do. When I worked on Wall Street, I had a wine collection.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to have wine shipped in from Napa, California, out to New Jersey. And I got obsessed with the whole thing. And I had an Excel spreadsheet and I knew what to drink when and where it came from and when we bought it. And excuse me, I would come home from work and then drink a bottle or two of wine with my husband, both of them. So I followed in the same tradition. You could have called me a functional alcoholic, which I think most of my family was. And there is this shame around the word alcoholic because we think of it as, the person living in the van by the river or, the drunk on the street. And yet a lot of the people I worked with on Wall Street, drinking was a huge part of the culture of when I started on Wall Street, the three martini lunches or
Yeah.
going out after work and having the couple bottles of wine and sealing the deal.
Right. Like networking and socializing, stress management. Sure. It
Mhm.
just goes with it absolutely would go with Wall Street
Right?
and
Because,
any other high powered position.
yes. And so if you went to one of these things and you didn't drink, you were
Hmm.
looked at kind of like, what's wrong with you? Maybe it's just like, I don't feel like having a drink.
Yeah.
There's,
Yeah. And
there's,
that's so true. And I think that's changing. I do think that's changing, or I'm hearing more that is becoming acceptable to navigate through those business networking events without alcohol. There's other options today that I don't think were available, say 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
I wasn't even aware of the cycle that I was in while I was on Wall Street.
Sure,
I
sure.
just numbed my pain in any way that I could.
Mhm.
And living with active alcoholism, I remember I would take a boat into Manhattan and then drive home. And as I would turn onto my street, I would just have this feeling of dread because I didn't know what I was walking into. And I'd pull up into the driveway and a lot of times and I didn't even know at the time he would start drinking at 10 or 11 in the morning. He had lost his job on Wall Street, went back to doing something that he hated and so he would drink to numb his own pain, except I still was highly functional and
Sure.
he as he spiraled. And yet me working 14-hour days was another part of my addiction.
Let's take a moment to hear a recovery story from one of my sponsors. At the age of 25, recently married and a new father, Jack found himself in a Texas rehab facility detoxing. After 10 years of addiction, he was finally able to admit that it was time to get help. Not only did SoberLink allow him to be accountable and track his sobriety, SoberLink allowed Jack to prove to himself and others that he could make the change he had always hoped for. SoberLink is the portable sobriety tracker, taking the recovery world by storm. It has built-in facial recognition, sensors that detect cheating, and instant results sent to contacts. It's the number one accountability tool for keeping yourself honest and rebuilding trust. Visit www.soberlink.com/sober-living and check out the show notes to click the link and receive $50 off your device today. Now back to our guest. Yeah. And so you can normalize it. I'm not as bad as him, and I still have my job. I worked on Wall Street too for a little bit.
Hmm.
And I remember at 5 o'clock, the like sea of people going down to get the train. Like you could just see this whole pack move through in their suits. It's just a cycle. And then you get up in the morning, you head back in. And, but you were functioning. You were going home and saying, I'm not as bad as this man, my husband. So in a sense, but you were still in a cycle.
I was, and I was doing exactly as I had been taught, as my mother had been taught, as my
Sure.
grandmother had been taught. A lot of times we don't realize that what we think of as normal isn't healthy.
Right.
And the men would drink, and then the parties on the weekends that were like networking things for my stepfather and his business associates, and the well, you can come into the living room, but children should be seen and not heard. There were so many
Yeah.
messages of silencing, of we don't express, we don't talk about these things. We don't want to, upset anybody or let anybody know what was going on. So, like I said, the house we lived in was a shell, just like the shell I had created around myself. And it was fascinating to me I guess it was about a year after my career on Wall Street ended. I started to work with a coach and it was online. It actually got me on to social media. I had
Hmm.
been, talk to the hand up at that point because I didn't want anyone to know or realize how I felt about myself
Hmm.
because I didn't feel very good about myself. Like my career was over, my marriage was over, and yet this was an 8-week program. And on the first call, she asked the question, how do you want to feel? And it cracked me wide open because I realized I couldn't answer the question. I could say, how did I feel? Which was based on external things. But how did I want to feel was an internal question that I couldn't answer, that I hadn't connected with since I was a child.
So, how did you want to feel?
I wanted to feel free. I wanted to feel heard, seen, free, empowered. Every year now, I pick a couple of words that are my theme for the year. This year is expansive. But it's like looking at, what does expansive mean to me? It's allowing myself to be seen. It's expanding in the work that I do. It's multi-layered, just like we are. This whole journey of healing is not about looking at the external outside world as many of us are taught to do. Again, it's coming back to whole new layers of safety and trust within ourselves. And I'm forever grateful for the first coach that I worked with, as well as myself, of saying yes to this journey of I want something better and different for myself, because even though I don't know where it's leading, I don't want to continue to live as I am right now.
What a difference from being quiet for so many years to now doing what you're doing. So I know you wrote a couple of books, and congratulations on that, because they're 2 international best-selling books. Can you talk about how and why you chose to write it down?
So, my first book, which was published 7 years ago this week, is The Message in the Bottle: Finding Hope and Peace Amidst the Chaos of Living with an Alcoholic. I initially started working with families of alcoholics. This is where I came from. This is where I did a lot of my initial healing work. When my ex-husband first went to rehab back in 2012, and I had been in recovery for a few years before that, I saw the changes that I had experienced in saying yes to myself. And I wanted to help families of alcoholics. And in each of the chapters, there are a lot of introspective questions. What I found is that a lot of friends who are in AA and are alcoholics, or have had their own experiences with drug addiction, also resonate with this book, because the subtitle of Finding Peace Amidst the Chaos of Living with an Alcoholic is sometimes ourselves. It is finding the peace within us. And so this first book is a lot edgier than my second. It's where I was 7 years ago,
Sure.
or 8 years ago, when I started writing it.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it is the journey of coming back to yourself. And it shares a lot about my own story and of living and marrying 2 alcoholics. My second book, The Impact of Silence: Heal Generational Appropriations and Reclaim the Sovereignty of Your Soul, is a deeper journey into our spiritual journey. Again, I go into some of my own story. I realized how pervasive it is within society and families to not talk about our feelings, to silence what it is that we're feeling, and the impact of that. My second book goes a lot more into the science of how our brain waves are, for instance, up through the age of 8. And we are so wide open, we're basically taking on the energy of everything and everyone around us. We don't know discernment. We don't know how to create boundaries. And if we're living in a dysfunctional situation, we learn dysfunction.
Mm-hmm.
We learn to not speak up. And I wrote this book after my travels. I actually, in January of 2019, sold everything
Mhm.
put my remaining things in storage, and traveled for 8 months. And it was a journey of self discovery. For the first time in over 30 years, I had no pets, no partner, no rent, and no mortgage. And I found safety in having a few of my cherished possessions in my 6 speed Mazda and
Mhm.
traveling around the country. And it was the beginning of going deeper into my own spiritual quest and of feeling safe and wandering and not having to have a plan and tight control over everything. Because that was one of the other things in my old life of I needed to create control. So I
Mhm.
felt safe in a world that did not feel safe. And there's a lot more to the story. And yet, so the second book is more of a spiritual healing offering. And there again in each chapter is an invitation for the reader to go deeper into their own story.
I like the word invitation. I think that, did you do the majority of the writing on that when you were on your 8 month quest of, is that where you wrote or is that where you just acquired the information for the second book?
I acquired some of the information and then I
Mm-hmm.
ended up moving to Utah, where I just moved from. I was there for 4 years. And it was while I was in Utah that this thing around boundaries and our energy and how we stand up and speak up for ourselves was really where I started to write this book. What's very interesting in that I got through the second developmental draft of that book, and only about 10% of it went into what was published. Books have a life of their own.
They
And
sure do. Yeah.
right? And what wanted to come through
Mm-hmm.
was something very different. I was also undergoing the journey of healing breast cancer.
Mm.
While I started, actually, I was diagnosed in the middle of writing the book. I put it down. When I picked it back up, that was when it had a completely different voice.
Okay. Yeah. Understood. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah. So you hit on two very big things that I think are so relevant to listeners is the family piece of addiction and alcoholism, and also it, the title of your book, The Impact of Silence. I've heard people throughout the years talk about how they were never able to talk about anything in their home, and and how that didn't serve them. So I think that these two books are really going to be something that if anyone would like to look them up, I'm going to put them in the show notes for to find you. So if you could just let listeners know, what are you doing now? Because I know your purpose is dedicated to helping people overcome trauma and what you went through as well. So you're helping other people do that. Can you speak to that a little bit and let other people know where they could find you?
absolutely. So currently, right now, I work one on one with people,
Okay.
and it's a mixture of both coaching and energy work. So it's the alchemy of it because there's times where we can have the awareness of something,
Mm-hmm.
and yet just having the awareness doesn't clear the energy of it. Because if we think of a situation or a person and continue to get triggered, there's something more to do. So I
Mm-hmm.
work one on one with people. And I actually just finished the first round of an 8 week program entitled The Energy of Boundaries.
Yeah.
And yet the people that work with me are like, they're ready. They've done a whole bunch of work. They want to be done with this.
Mm-hmm.
And we typically work together in 3 month increments because that gives them a safe container to give a voice to some of the things they may never have given a voice to, as well as clearing what they've been in, what they've internalized. So um, it's an incredible journey and honor to be able to do this work with people because when we have that freedom of no longer carrying the story, and I like to say, there is no story that can't be healed. And people can find me on my website, which is Way of the Diamond Warrior.
Thank you so much for bringing out some real good insights on multi-generational addiction, the impact of silence, being heard, and just living free, living a freer version of yourself.
Thank you. It's been an honor.
Thank you for tuning into the Sober Living Stories podcast. If you have been inspired, consider subscribing and sharing with anyone who could use hope in their lives. Remember to stay tuned for more inspiring stories in the episodes to come. To view our featured author of the month or to become a guest yourself, visit www.jessicastepanovic.com.